Well, as I mentioned, we're going to start this new series this morning, and we're going to begin kicking off with a look at loneliness. Some of you remember Erma Bombeck. Raise your hands if you remember reading some of her books. She could be hilarious. She could also be very poignant as well. She once shared a story about a day where she just wanted to be left alone. You ever had one of those days where things seemed so hectic leading up to it, and you thought, oh, I just need some alone time. But that particular morning, she'd had 3 long, draining phone calls that didn't seem to end. Then she gets on her way to the airport to make a trip that she needs to make, and her taxi driver wouldn't stop talking. He was going on and on about his son's college life, and boy, she was just absolutely mentally exhausted. Finally, she gets to the gate with 30 minutes before boarding. She plops down in a chair, opens a novel that she wanted to read, and she thought, finally, just finally, a little bit of peace and quiet. Then the woman seated next to her spoke up and said, I bet it's cold in Chicago. Erma didn't even look up. She said, I was a bit cold. I gave a one-word reply, likely. But the woman kept talking. She said, I haven't been to Chicago in nearly 3 years. My son lives there. Still trying to shut things down. Erma said, that's nice. And then the woman opened her heart. She said, my husband's body is on the plane. We were married 53 years. I don't drive, and when he died, a nun had to drive me home from the hospital, and the funeral director brought me to the airport today. And then Erma said something I think many of us have perhaps felt at some point. She said, I don't think I've ever detested myself more than I did in that moment. Here was another human being crying out to be heard, and she turned in desperation to a stranger, somebody who cared more about a novel than the real-life story unfolding just inches away. Most of us have been on both sides of that equation, right? We have been the person who didn't want to be bothered, and perhaps we have been the one who just needed someone to listen and perhaps felt brushed off. In 2024, the Gallup organization, after some extensive research, reported that 52 million adults in the United States are dealing with significant loneliness. 1 in 5 say that they feel lonely every single day. And the American Psychiatric Association found that about 30% of adults feel lonely at least once a week. And here's what might surprise you. It's not just older adults. Increasingly, loneliness is common among younger people. Nearly a third of Americans between the ages of 18 and 34 say they feel lonely every day or at least several times a week. Now, for some, it's a passing season, but for many people, it is a daily companion. Maybe you're familiar with the name Philip Zimbardo. He was a well-known psychology professor at Stanford University. He passed away last year, but he did a lot of important work and research into loneliness and isolation. And years ago, early in his research, he made this striking statement. He said, there is no more destructive influence on physical and mental health than the isolation of you from me and us from them. That's powerful. And research continues to back that up. Studies have shown that loneliness can be just as harmful to your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day and can lead to premature death. Loneliness has been linked to weakened immune systems, poor sleep, depression, anxiety, and even suicide. There's a higher risk of cognitive decline and dementia, lower self-esteem, increased stress, more substance abuse, lost productivity, and rising healthcare costs, as well as added strain to our social services networks. So it's absolutely staggering, the consequences of loneliness. And all of this reminds us of something that's deeply biblical and profoundly true. You and I were created for connection. We were created for relationship, community, fellowship. And when we're cut off from that, it doesn't just hurt us emotionally, it can actually take the life out of us. Now, when we talk about loneliness, it helps to realize that it doesn't always look the same for every person. It shows up in all different ways, depending on the person. Some of you can remember the old Beatles song, Eleanor Rigby. It paints such a haunting picture, doesn't it, of loneliness. It asks all the lonely people, where do they all come from? And you may remember from the song, if you've heard it, you've got Eleanor picking up rice from the church floor after weddings that she has not been a part of, and she's living in a dream. You've got Father Mackenzie, who's brushing the dust off of his hands after a funeral, walking away from the grave with this heavy sense of emptiness. It's a reminder that loneliness is all around us and often hidden in plain sight. When we think about loneliness, we should think about all the lonely people, all the ways loneliness manifests itself. You see it in the lonely student. You can imagine a high school student walking through the crowded halls and yet feeling completely unseen. They scroll their social media feed, they see the highlight reels, and they feel left out and forgotten. At lunch, they sit quietly alone, hoping that somebody might notice, that somebody might sit down by them. But behind the smile and maybe the tight hoodie that they're wearing, there's deep loneliness, an aching to belong, a wondering if somebody truly cares. Or on that same high school campus, you might have the popular quarterback or the head cheerleader who seems to have it together, at least on the surface, but behind the scenes they wonder if anyone likes or knows them for who they really are, if they understand some of the things that are going on in their family life or the struggles that they have with self-doubt or image problems, all kind of hidden behind that smiling face. There's the lonely student, and there's the lonely single. Coming home to a quiet apartment, dinner for one, evenings filled with silence. They scroll through their phone, they watch others share their life with somebody else, a life partner, all the time wondering if anyone thinks of them at the end of the day. And there's the lonely spouse. Sometimes single people are surprised to find out that marriage doesn't automatically cure loneliness. Some of the loneliest people you'll ever meet are married. God designed marriage as this beautiful gift, this place for openness and connection and deep intimacy, but sadly, that gift is often unused. Some couples end up like two ships passing in the kitchen, living under the same roof but barely connecting, just coexisting instead of really sharing life together. And there's the lonely survivor. I have sat with a number of friends in the faith who have had to walk through the heartbreak of losing a spouse. They built a life together, shared routines, favorite restaurants, the music they both loved. And it's not just the big things like the vacations and travel, it's thousands of little details that made them them. And then one of them is suddenly gone and the whole world seems off balance for a time. There's a grief that runs deep, and with it a loneliness that kind of settles in like a heavy fog. The couples they once connected with no longer include them. And this happens as well in those who have experienced the pain of divorce. And there's the lonely senior. Some people look back in their later years at a life that was filled perhaps with meaningful accomplishments. They were respected in their work. There were those years when the house was full, family, friends, laughter. But over time, one by one, those closest to them begin to pass on. First a friend here, a coworker there, maybe a cousin, an extended family, but then a spouse. Friends that they worshiped with that they no longer see because those have died. And all these that they've shared life with are slowly passing away. And while their family still loves them, they're busy. They're caught up in work. They're raising kids. They're building lives of their own. And so there are many seniors who find themselves sitting quietly asking, why am I still here? Kind of feeling the ache of outliving the ones who knew them best that they shared life with. And there's the lonely sufferer. The person lying in a hospital bed or homebound or sitting in a quiet room at a care facility, once vibrant and active, they're now limited by pain or a body that no longer cooperates. The days blur together, visitors are few, conversations are brief. They kind of watch the world go on without them, feeling forgotten. But behind the quiet exterior is somebody longing for connection, somebody longing for touch, for a reminder that they still matter. And then there's the lonely servant of God. Even Moses, one of the greatest leaders in Scripture, felt the weight of loneliness. You might remember back in Numbers chapter 11 at verse 14, he cries out to God. He said, I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. Leadership can do that to you. It can isolate you. It can make you feel alone. And many who serve in ministry or church leadership know exactly what that feels like. You carry responsibility. You make hard calls and decisions, and sometimes it feels like you're alone. Criticism comes easy. Misunderstandings begin to pile up, and suddenly you find yourself feeling distant even from the people you're trying to serve and that you love so much. Missionaries out in the field can feel it too. They're doing the work, often in very hard places, and yet they wrestle with this sense that they've been forgotten. The emails begin to slow down, the support fades, and they begin to wonder if anybody back home really sees them. So loneliness takes so many forms. It can be that high school student lost in the crowd, the single adult coming home to silence, the married couple drifting apart but living under the same roof, the senior who's outlived the ones who knew them best, or the person in a hospital bed longing for somebody to visit, longing for somebody to remember. Wherever it shows up, loneliness is real and it's painful. But here's some good news. God sees, God knows, and God loves. And to the degree this is helpful as far as loneliness, if you feel lonely today yourself, know, number one, that you are not the only one. You're not alone in your loneliness. As a matter of fact, thinking about some of those great spiritual leaders of the past, we think about King David. King David knew that as he sat on the throne of Israel as shepherd and ruler, he was often very much alone. And even though he sat on that throne, that place of prominence and prestige and power, he also knew what it was to be very lonely. He knew what it was to hide in the caves while enemies were hunting him down. In Psalm 102, he says, I am just like a desert owl, like a bird alone on the rooftop. Over in Psalm 142 at verse 4, he writes, look and see, there is no one at my right hand. No one is concerned for me. I have no refuge. No one cares for my life. Boy, that's not just a feeling of being lonely, that's a feeling of being completely abandoned. So here's David, this mighty warrior king, and he's pouring out his heart about how he feels. And it's a reminder that loneliness doesn't care about your title or about your success. It also reminds me why I often direct people to the Psalms when they're experiencing loneliness. Or we think about the prophet Jeremiah. This is the prophet who wrote an entire book called Lamentations. Jeremiah is often referred to as the weeping prophet, and for good reason. He carried this heavy heart for a people who just simply wouldn't listen, and that burden isolated him. As a matter of fact, in Jeremiah chapter 9 and verse 2, he said, oh, that I had in the desert a lodging place for travelers so that I might leave my people and go away from them. Boy, he wanted to quit the prophetic business and go into the motel business. He was surrounded by people, and yet he longed to escape because he was weary of the rejection, of the rebellion, of the heartbreak. His calling was clear, but it came with a deep sense of loneliness. Sometimes doing what's right can feel like walking alone. And then you think about the Apostle Paul. Man, this guy traveled all over the world. He helped plant churches. He spoke multiple languages. He wrote a big chunk of the New Testament. And he had close friendships in the faith. And yet even Paul knew what it was like to be deeply lonely. In one of his letters to Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 4 at verses 9 to 11, he writes to this young minister and he says, "Do your best to come to me quickly. Only Luke is with me." And then down at verse 16, he says, "At my first offense, no one came to my support. Everyone deserted me." Can you imagine that? After giving his life for the mission of Christ, Paul ends up lonely in prison, largely alone, feeling abandoned. And it just reminds us, loneliness isn't a sign of weakness or failure. Even the most strong, faithful servants of God have walked through it. And then I think most importantly, it's important to realize that, number two, not only are you not alone, Jesus struggled with loneliness. As we read the gospel accounts in John 18, Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 23, it was dark in the Kidron Valley, east of the temple. 8 of Jesus' disciples were asleep in a grove of olive trees. And there, a little farther in, not far from Jesus, while they're sleeping, our Lord is alone, distressed, and praying. And as they're drifting in and out of sleep, there's an armed crowd that's approaching to arrest him. Judas, one of his own, led a detachment of soldiers right to him, knowing this place of solitude, knowing this place of prayer, and his friends fled. Jesus was taken first to Annas, where he was questioned, and you might remember slapped across the face for answering, in their mind, disrespectfully. Then he was sent on to Caiaphas. False witnesses were brought in. They'd been paid to accuse him, but Jesus stayed silent. They spat on him. They mocked him. They beat him. He was taken to Pilate, who questioned him, but Pilate couldn't find any fault with him. And when Pilate learned that Jesus was from Galilee, he sent him on to Herod. And Herod questions him at length, but Jesus didn't answer. So what do the soldiers do? They mock him some more. They dress him up as a king, and they beat him and send him back to Pilate. In just a few hours, Jesus goes through 4 trials, and yet not one person came to his defense. No friend stepped forward. No one Jesus had healed or helped said a word. Not even a lawyer helped plead his case. He stood completely alone, rejected, beaten, and despised. But he wasn't truly alone. In the garden, Jesus said, this is Matthew 26, verse 53, "Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" Jesus was saying, my Father is near, ready, present, faithful, and he was the one who saw Jesus through it all. And that's the hope for us. That same friend can be very close to you. In your loneliness, in your pain, he is the one who never leaves or abandons his friends, his children, his people. And here's what's beautiful. Not only does Jesus know what loneliness feels like, he also went out of his way to befriend the lonely. He didn't just understand their pain, he stepped into it. So our third and final thought this morning is this: Jesus befriended the lonely. He saw them, stepped in, showed them love. I think of Zacchaeus in Luke 19. It was a hot day in Jericho, and you might remember the word had spread that Jesus was passing through. The streets were filled like a parade route, people lining up just to get a glimpse. And what does Zacchaeus do? Zacchaeus is resourceful. He finds a place in a sycamore tree to step up into so that he can see above the crowds. Zacchaeus was a tax collector. He was a traitor in the eyes of his fellow Jews, working for the Romans and pocketing the extra for himself. He was despised. Add to that, he was short, and people probably joked about that. He knew rejection. But Zacchaeus was determined. He climbed up into that sycamore tree, and Jesus stops right over at that tree, looks up and says, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." And in that very moment, Jesus said, "Zacchaeus, I see you. You matter to me and you matter to God. I see your potential." Zacchaeus met not just a teacher, not just a popular prophet or rabbi, he met a friend. A friend who saw through the shame, who saw through the rejection, a friend who would never walk away. Then as you're reading in Luke chapter 6, there's this man with a shriveled hand in the synagogue. And Jesus is there teaching in that synagogue on the Sabbath day, and that man had probably lived his whole life with the stares of fellow Jews, their whispers, because it was thought that if you suffered this way, it was probably because of some sin in your life. So people kept their distance. I'm sure some of the kids made fun of him. And the religious leaders, they probably just barely tolerated him in the synagogue. But Jesus called him forward, right there in front of everybody. And Jesus healed his shriveled hand. And he wanted the whole crowd to see that it is always right, even on the Sabbath day, to help the hurting. That man walked away healed, seen, valued. Jesus befriended him when nobody else would. And then, John chapter 8. Well, you talk about a lonely woman caught in the act of adultery, dragged into the temple courts, thrown before Jesus, guilty, humiliated, with a crowd of people ready to stone her. But Jesus knew it was a trap. He knelt down and he begins writing in the dirt. When they pressed him, he said, "Let the one without sin throw the first stone." And one by one, starting with the olders first and then the younger, the crowd left. Only Jesus remained. And he told her, "Go and leave your life of sin." She met a friend who wouldn't condemn her, but called her to the possibility of a new life. In each of those stories, someone who had been pushed aside, cast off, or even shamed meets Jesus, and everything changes. These aren't just healing stories. These are stories of God's friendship with people. Stories of Jesus stepping into lonely lives and offering belonging and dignity and love. The Bible calls that grace. Grace, you see, is Jesus looking up at Zacchaeus and saying, "Hey, you belong. I'll come to your house. We're going to spend some time together." It's Jesus reaching out to the man who everybody else avoided. It's Jesus seeing worth in a woman that the world at her time had written off. Jesus didn't just acknowledge the lonely, he befriended the lonely, and he still does. That's the kind of friend that Jesus is, one who sees, one who knows, and one who loves and never walks away. So, what can I do? If I'm lonely, kind of suffering that sense that maybe there's not people that care, people that won't connect, if you're in that place right now, the first thing I'd encourage you to do is to accept God's friendship. Accept God's friendship. We've seen this again in every story. Jesus didn't just notice the people that we mentioned, he moved toward them. He extended friendship. And that same invitation is open to you and to me today. Now, I know here's what some of us struggle with deep down. Maybe you don't feel worthy of it. Maybe your self-esteem has kind of taken a hit. Maybe you've made choices that you regret. Maybe you think God couldn't possibly like, let alone love somebody like me. Maybe you just feel unloved or even unlovable. And then there are some who know that accepting God's friendship would mean letting go of sin that you might have grown comfortable with. But if you want to truly be free, that's the place to find true freedom and true relationship with the God who loves you. Jesus offers an invitation to every person. Just like he did to the broken, the rejected, to the ashamed, he says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, burdened with life. I'll give you rest. He offers friendship like no other, faithful healing, full of grace. But we have to accept it. We have to open the door. He stands at the door and knocks, but it's up to us to let him into our life, to put our faith in him, to let him give us new life in baptism, confessing him as Lord. It's a wonderful invitation to the best friendship you'll ever have. The second thing I'd encourage you to do is befriend others. Once we have accepted God's friendship, we're not meant to walk alone. That's one of the reasons God created the church. We're brought into a family of people. But like any relationship, it takes effort. It takes initiative. God places us in this new community, his forever family, not just to receive friendship, but to be a friend to others as well. And what that means is taking the initiative, introducing ourselves, starting conversations, or when one is started with us, going ahead and having the conversation, inviting someone to coffee, joining a small group, serving on a team. Too often what we do when we're lonely is we wait for others to make the first move, but friendship in the church grows when we step out with open hearts. It's in those connections that we then begin to experience the richness of the community God blesses us with here, and where we find a place to be known, encouraged, and to have people that walk along with us in life. And then finally, minister to the lonely. Accept God's friendship. Make friends, befriend the lonely, minister to the lonely. Maybe you're somebody and you've been listening to this whole sermon and you say, well, this really isn't my deal. I don't struggle much with loneliness. As a matter of fact, I've got more people in my life that I know what to do with. Well, the truth is then, you are in a powerful position to serve. Because one of the greatest ministries you could ever have is ministry to the lonely. They're everywhere, all around us. In this church auditorium, in our church family, in our community, in our daily lives. Some are grieving the loss of a loved one, and sometimes they feel like they're doing it alone. Some are in care facilities or stuck at home and unable to get out. Some walk into church every week, hoping that somebody will notice them, but they leave quickly. And maybe you need to be the one to run after them and tap them on the shoulder and say, hi, I'm so-and-so. Wanted to get to know you. When you do reach out, a phone call, a visit, maybe even a handwritten note or an invitation to coffee or lunch, When you sit with someone who's alone, you're doing the Lord's work. You're doing true ministry. And you don't have to have all the answers to do that. You just have to care. You just have to show up with love. And here's something I can guarantee you. If you make it your mission to care for the lonely, you will never be without life-giving ministry to do in this world. And if we're going to be a church that impacts our community, one of the greatest places to start is to minister to lonely people, both among us and in our community. I hope this has given you some things to think about. May God bless you. This week we're going to sing one more song. Next week we'll come back with another theme related to emotions. I hope you'll go out and find somebody to reach out to this week and that you have others reach to you.